On the afternoon of August 12, 1915, the heat over Suvla Bay lay like a weight. The air shimmered above salt flats and dry scrub, cicadas screaming in the thorn bushes, the smell of dust and thyme and cordite hanging low. From a shallow ridge, British observers watched a line of khaki figures rise out of their trenches and begin to walk forward. They did not run. They walked, rifles slung, as they had been taught on the parade grounds back in England. Ahead of them, there was no trench system, no barbed wire and neat lines, only a broken plain of vineyards, dry watercourses, scattered oaks, and a few white-walled farmhouses that the maps called Kuchik Anafarta Ova. About 250 men of the 1st/5th Battalion, Norfolk Regiment, were in that first wave. By sunset, the battalion would effectively cease to exist as a fighting unit. By winter, a single sentence in an official dispatch would turn their loss into one of the great ghost stories of the First World War. Nothing more was ever seen or heard of any of them. They charged into the forest and were lost to sight or sound. Not one of them ever came back. That is the legend. It has been told on television, in books about UFOs, in Turkish magazines about the supernatural, and in village pubs in Norfolk for more than 100 years. The truth is slower, hotter, dustier, and much more painful. And to understand it, you have to start not in Turkey, but in the flat fields of East Anglia 7 years earlier. In 1908, Britain created the Territorial Force, part-time soldiers who trained on evenings and weekends. The 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment was one of those units. Its men came from market towns and farms across the north of the county, from Great Yarmouth on the coast, from Dereham and Fakenham inland, from the Broads and the barley fields. They were clerks, blacksmiths, school teachers, farm laborers, and gamekeepers. One company, E Company, was raised largely from the royal estate at Sandringham, where King George V spent each winter. Its commander was Captain Frank Beck, a man in his 50s, the king's land agent, respected, efficient, and deeply paternal toward the men who worked the estate. When war was declared in August 1914, the territorials were mobilized. The one of 5th Norfolks, the first-line battalion, left Norwich by train amid crowds and brass bands. They trained through the winter, first in England, then, in the spring of 1915, they were sent east. They did not go to France. They were put on ships for the Dardanelles, part of a new army being assembled for a gamble conceived by Winston Churchill, to force the Straits, take Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. By the time the Norfolks arrived at Gallipoli in July 1915, the gamble had already failed. The landings at Cape Helles in April and at Anzac had bogged down into trench warfare as deadly as anything on the Western Front. Sir Ian Hamilton, the British commander-in-chief, planned one last throw, a fresh landing at Suvla Bay on the Aegean coast, north of the existing beachheads. It would be carried out by the newly arrived 9 Corps under the elderly and hesitant Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford. The landings on the night of 6 to 7 August were a tactical surprise and an operational disaster. The troops got ashore almost unopposed, but Stopford stayed on his ship. His divisions milled on the beaches, water ran short, orders were vague, and the vital high ground of the Teke Ridge, which overlooked the whole plain, was left to the Turks. By August 10th, Ottoman reinforcements under Mustafa Kemal had sealed the hills. The chance was gone. Hamilton, desperate to salvage something, ordered a series of piecemeal attacks across the plain to at least secure a better line for the winter. One of those attacks fell to the 54th East Anglian Division, a territorial division like the Norfolks themselves, which had just landed and was already exhausted and short of artillery. Inside the 54th was 163 Brigade, and inside 163 Brigade were the 1/4 and 1/5 Norfolks. On the morning of August 12th, the men were told they would attack that afternoon toward a low rise marked on British maps as Hill 70, then push on toward the Anafarta Valley. The objective was not glorious, just a better jumping-off trench for tomorrow. There was almost no time for reconnaissance. The artillery support was a handful of guns with limited shells. The air was stifling, over 90 degrees, and the men had been issued only one water bottle each. At about 4:30, the battalion climbed out. On their left was the 1/4 Norfolk, on their right the 1/8 Hampshire. They advanced in artillery formation, small groups spaced out, over open ground that rose very gently. Almost at once, Turkish shrapnel began to burst overhead, puffs of black smoke and whining splinters. From the left, from the direction of a wooded knoll called Kireç Tepe, Turkish machine guns opened enfilade fire, sweeping the line from the flank. The 1/5th kept going. They were on the extreme right of the brigade, and for a moment their advance was faster than the others, which meant they became exposed, a salient in the air. Second Lieutenant Eric Fox, a young officer with the leading platoon, reached a sunken farm track about 1,400 yards out, a natural piece of cover. He halted his men there, as doctrine told him to wait for the rest of the battalion to come up. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Horace Proctor Beecham, the commanding officer, a baronet and a regular soldier in his 40s, saw the pause and waved them on. He was a brave man, perhaps too brave for that afternoon. He shouted for them to press forward. Fox obeyed. The small group left the sunken road, bunched slightly as they crossed a gap between two vineyards, and at that moment a Turkish Maxim gun, well sighted in scrub on their left front, caught them perfectly. Almost the entire leading party was cut down in seconds. The rest of the battalion, coming up in small packets, lost cohesion in the broken ground. The plain was not flat at all up close. It was a maze of dried irrigation ditches, low stone walls, vines on the ground, and scattered home oaks that broke line of sight. Officers fell early. Captain Frank Beck was seen urging his Sandringham men forward near a small white farmhouse. His nephew, Lieutenant Alec Beck, was close by. Proctor Beecham himself reached a cluster of farm buildings with his adjutant, Captain Patrick. Private Sidney Pooley, who survived, later remembered hearing the colonel shout his last order there. A very English, very Norfolk phrase, "Hound them out, boys." Then the Turkish infantry counterattacked. The Ottoman defenders in this sector were not elite troops, but they were fresh, they knew the ground, and they were fighting from cover. The Ottoman 7th Division's war diary records small groups of British penetrating far beyond their own artillery cover, becoming isolated, and being engaged at close range. There was no mass surrender. There was no formal execution. There was what always happens when light infantry walks too far into enemy ground. They were shot one by one, or bayonet in the scrub, or took wounds and lay unable to crawl back. As the light failed, the firing died down. Men who were still alive and unwounded began to filter back. Major W. Barton, the second in command, and Lieutenant Evelyn Beck, another of the Sandringham family, gathered about 70 men in the dark and led them back toward the British trenches. They arrived exhausted, parched, many without rifles. They could give almost no coherent account of where the others were. They had simply disappeared into the dusk and the scrub. Back in Norfolk, the telegrams began to arrive 2 weeks later. The Eastern Daily Press and the Lynn News on August 28th published the first lists: officers missing, believed killed. In the villages around Sandringham, at West Newton, at Dersingham, at Wolferton, women stood at cottage doors reading the same names over and over. Beck, Proctor Beecham. The king himself, who knew these men not as soldiers but as foresters and keepers, sent a personal telegram to Hamilton on September 1st. "What has happened to my Sandringhams?" he asked. Hamilton did not know, not exactly. His staff told him 16 officers and about 250 men were unaccounted for. He replied to the king with the language of the time, praising their ardor and dash, saying they had pressed ahead of the rest of the brigade into close broken country and been lost touch with. It was a kind way of saying they had advanced too far and been destroyed. For months later, Hamilton needed a phrase for his final dispatch that would explain the terrible losses of the whole campaign to the public. He remembered the Norfolks. He wrote that very mysterious thing. Nothing more was ever seen or heard of any of them. They charged into the forest and were lost to sight or sound. Not one of them ever came back. It was published in the London Gazette in January 1916. The Eastern Daily Press ran it under the headline, "Sandringham Men Disappear." A myth was born in print. The truth was already in the casualty returns. Captain Coxon of the Norfolks, wounded and captured, was alive in a Turkish hospital in Constantinople by February 1916 and managed to get a letter home. Private Pooley and others gave interviews saying plainly there was no forest, no cloud, no mystery charge, just a confused advance and men who did not return. But a letter from a prisoner does not travel as fast as a mystery. After the war, the Imperial War Graves Commission sent teams to Gallipoli to find and bury the dead. In 1919, the Reverend Pierre Edwards, who had been the 1/5 Tejas Padre, walked the ground at Küçük Anafarta with Turkish laborers. About 800 yards behind what had been the Turkish front line, scattered over roughly 1 square mile, they found remains. 180 bodies in total, mostly Norfolks, with a few Hampshires, Suffolks, and Cheshires mixed in. Only 2 could be identified by discs, Privates Barnaby and Carter. Many were around the ruins of the farm where Proctor Beecham had last been seen. A Turkish farmer told Edwards that when he returned to his land in 1915, he had found it covered with dead British soldiers and had dragged them into a small ravine to clear his fields. Edwards buried them where they lay, in what is now Asmack Cemetery. The official records compiled as soldiers died in the Great War give the final butcher's bill for the battalion between the 12th and the 31st of August 1915 as 11 officers and 151 other ranks killed, with many more wounded. It was not 250 vanished. It was worse in a way because it was knowable, ordinary, and preventable. For 40 years, the story slept. Then in 1965, at a Gallipoli veterans reunion in New Zealand, 3 old sappers told a journalist they had watched from a distance on August 12th as a British battalion marched up into a strange, low cloud that hugged the ground, a cloud that did not move with the wind, and that when the cloud lifted an hour later, the men were gone. The story was printed, then reprinted in books about the unexplained in the 1970s. In the 1990s, a Turkish popular history magazine, Phenomen, ran it with illustrations of flying saucers, claiming the Norfolks had been abducted by aliens. In 1992, a British police officer turned writer, Nigel McCrary, published The Vanished Battalion. He rejected the UFO theory but revived the other myth, that the men had been captured and then massacred by the Turks, shot in the head after surrendering. In 1999, the BBC turned it into a film, All the King's Men, starring David Jason as Frank Beck. Millions watched. The image of the Sandringham gamekeepers, led by their squire, walking to their doom for king and country, became fixed. Historians pushed back. Tim Travers at the University of Calgary and Turkish scholar Burton Selleck went into the Ottoman archives in Ankara, something no English writer had done. They found the Turkish reports of August 12th. No mention of a mass capture, no order for executions, just the usual terse notes of machine guns engaging dispersed enemy infantry in the scrub, and a few prisoners taken over several days. Michael Hickey, author of the standard Gallipoli history, pointed out that the Turks had no motive to massacre territorials in August 1915, and that head wounds are exactly what you expect from close-range fire in broken terrain. Steve Smith, a former RAF officer and Norfolk battlefield guide, walked the ground again and again with maps and diaries. He showed that there was no forest to charge into, only orchards and vineyards. He found the sunken road, the farm, the ravine. He published the survivor testimonies that had been sitting in local newspapers since 1915. So what really happened? A territorial battalion, tired, thirsty, poorly supported by guns, was ordered to attack late in the day across open ground toward an objective it could not see. It advanced too fast on its right, lost touch with its neighbors, and its leading troops were cut down in a natural killing ground. Its commander, trying to maintain momentum, pushed his men further into a maze of cover where Turkish machine guns and infantry were waiting. In the failing light, cohesion collapsed. Some men died where they fell. Some crawled into ditches and died overnight. A handful were taken prisoner. The rest, about 70, found their way back after dark. There was no cloud. There was no alien light. There was no deliberate massacre. There was only the kind of small, local catastrophe that happened hundreds of times on the Western Front and at Gallipoli, a mistake of planning paid for by other men's sons. Why then does the story refuse to die? Partly because Hamilton's sentence is perfect prose. Partly because the royal connection gives it a fairy tale quality, the king's men following their master to the other world. Partly because Gallipoli itself is awound in 3 nations, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, and Turkey, and we want our wounds to mean something more than bad maps and thirst. If you go to Gallipoli today, a guide will take you to Asmack Cemetery, a quiet walled garden among fields near the village of Anafarta. The headstones are mostly inscribed, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. Two of them say Barnaby and Carter, Norfolk Regiment, August 12, 1915. In the register, the names of Proctor Beecham, Frank Beck, Alec Beck, Pat Trick, and 147 others are listed on the Hellies Memorial 20 miles away, because they have no known grave. Stand there in August and the heat is the same as it was. The cicadas are the same. The scent of time is the same. You can see the sunken road, the line of oaks, the white farmhouse rebuilt. You realize how far they got and how little that distance looks on a map, and how final 800 yards can be when you have no water and the machine guns have the range. The men of the 1/5 did not vanish. They walked forward, as they were ordered, into a place that swallowed sound, and they stayed there. The mystery is not where they went. The mystery is why we keep needing them to have disappeared into a cloud, when the much harder truth is that they disappeared into history, one by one on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, because someone far behind the line drew an arrow on a map.